Guy Britton here with ILIO. Thanks for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to show you how we can engineer a bass guitar sound perfect for that kind of retro-inspired disco pop bass tone that you hear on so many records today. We're going to be doing this all using just a single DI'd bass guitar, along with a bunch of awesome plugins from Overloud. So without further ado, let's jump in and take a look at what's going on. So the track we're going to be working with today is a track called Radioactive by Kate Lomas, which is a song that I produced and mixed. And if you've seen the video on how to nail pop guitar tones using THU from Overloud, then you may have heard this song before. This is a disco-inspired modern pop kind of thing, very much driven by the bass line. And the bass line on this it's a great performance, but it is just a single DI dry bass guitar. So it's lacking a bit of tone and a bit of depth. But I'll play you a bit of the track and then I'll show you how we're going to shape that up into something that sounds much more like a finished record.
God is so unstable. Go back, right back to the start. You can put your cards on the table. I'll be looking for your place inside my heart. Flooding like I'm no.
So you can hear there's loads of character in that bass line. The bass line itself is really cool. The performance is really good. There's a lot of groove in there. There's a lot of feel going on and lots of different runs and stuff, which are adding so much movement to the track. But the bass tone itself is just not quite right at the moment. It's not sitting in the track. It's all over the place in terms of the dynamic and the tone. So I'm going to show you how we can correct that and how we can really shape this up into something that sounds great. So the first thing you'll notice is I've got this single DI track at the moment, which we're going to mute for now. Underneath this, I have this track stack here called bass guitar. Now this is just a bus that all of these individual tracks are running to. We have this track called bass DI, bass dist, bass sub, bass amp, and bass width. And as we go through this video, I'll explain exactly what all these are doing. But basically what we're going to do is start by copying this original DI bass guitar onto this new bass DI track down here. Now this track is also running to this bass guitar bus where we're going to do some extra processing later on. But to begin with, we're going to start on this bass DI track. Now the first thing that I want to do here is try and control these dynamics because it's really up and down. You can see where all these runs are happening in the bass line. It's jumping up, it's coming back down again, and we want to sort of flatten that dynamic out so that it sits and locks in the track a lot more. What I'm going to use for this is the Gem Comp 76, which is an 1176 style compressor. You'll notice on this one it's a little bit different. Most 1176s, 7 is the fastest attack and 1 is slow, and the same for the release. But on this one, it actually behaves more like a standard compressor would. So 1 is the fastest attack, 1 is the fastest release. I've got this set to about 4, so it's a medium attack and a relatively fast release. So what that's doing is it's letting through the initial transient, but it's pinning down the rest of the bass guitar tone. So if we enable this, we'll hear what this is doing. So you can hear that compressor's working quite hard. It's doing a lot to squash those peaks and tighten that bass line up so that it sits nicely in the track and we're not having peaks jumping up and down. You'll notice I was flicking through the different revisions. We have the revision A, the revision D, and the revision F. I find the revision A is a little too distorted on this one. It has a bit more saturation and a bit more drive. The D to me feels like a nice balance of drive and being fast enough to control those peaks without totally squashing like the attack of the pick and kind of killing that feel of that bass line. So for me, that's working really nicely. What I'm then going to do is insert a stock EQ after this. And in this case, I'm taking out everything up to 150 hertz. And you may think, well, why are you taking out all of the bass in a bass guitar? And the reason for that is we're going to create a separate track in a moment, which is going to be responsible purely for the low end of the bass. So on this track, the idea is we have this DI sound, which is pinned down by that compressor, and then we're taking the low end away so that we have complete control over that attack of that pick, that sort of mid-range of the DI sound. And then what we're going to do after that is copy this DI track down to this bass sub-track. Just going to move this underneath the DI, and we're going to do the opposite now with the stock EQ. So on this one, I'm filtering out everything above 150 hertz. And what this is doing is allowing us to take complete control over the sub lower frequencies of that bass guitar sound on its own track, and we can process that completely separately. Now you might say, why not just do that with like a multi-band compressor or something like that? And that's fair enough. But for me, I like having the control. I like having it on a fader. I like being able to just turn it up and down as and when I want. And it's also much more useful to be able to automate that in certain parts of the mix. You might want more low end here, less low end there. Just gives us more control over the tone. If I just bring this initial bass DI track back down and let's hear these two together. You can hear that's just the low end now. So we're just going to be working on the low end on this particular track. And again, I want to control the dynamics of this, but I don't want to be so aggressive this time. So in order to do that, what I'm using is the Gem Comp LA, which is in this case, the LA 3A instance. We can switch between the 2A and the 3A. The 3A is a little bit faster. I find this really useful for controlling this low end. So let's take a listen to what this compressor is doing. Okay, so what I'm hearing there is that when I engage the 2A, it's cleaner, it's not as distorted, whereas the 3A is a little grittier. So I'm actually going to stick with the 2A and just use that to control that low end, keep that low end nice and tight, nice and smooth without over compressing it. We still want a little bit of movement there. So let's take a listen to that with the drums, and I'll just bypass those plugins and see what difference we've made so far. Okay, so already it sounds tighter to me. It feels like that low end is much more controlled. In that original DI bass sound, the low end is really like jumping on certain notes and then it's fading away when he runs up the neck on the bass. Whereas now it feels like that low end is more controlled. The mid-range is a little bit more focused where we've added that compression on the DI track. We want to go a step further now and start to add a bit more flavor into this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another copy of this onto this bass amp track down here. Now what this is going to be is the bass DI, but this time running through an amp. So I'm going to use THU again. And in this case, I'm actually using the Made in Rock JUP 320, which is a model of the acoustic 320, which is like an old 70s bass amp used by a lot of rock bands back in the 70s. You may be thinking like, why are you using something that's made for rock on a disco pop bass tune? But the reason for that is that this has quite a lot of grit to it. So it just sounds really good. And it doesn't really matter what it's sort of made for. You know, I think so long as it sounds good and it works, then we're going to go with it. So let's take a listen to what this is doing. I've got channel A, EQ engaged. We've got a parametric EQ here and a graphic EQ as well, which is kind of doing sort of a happy face thing, taking out some 300 hertz, boosting some 2K upwards. And then we're also doing like a treble boost on the parametric, as well as a little mid-range dip and boosting some bass. And that sounds like this. So it's not hugely different, but it's adding some tone, it's scooping out some of that mid-range, and it's making it feel a bit more like what I would expect a bass amp to sound like. And this is going to help add some flavor and a bit more character to the overall bass sound when we blend this in with that original DI track and that sub track. You'll notice over here to the right, we have this mic selection on this bass amp cab. And what this is this allows us to select a bunch of different mics for different tones on the bass. At the moment, I've got it on the Austria Gold 414, which is the like AKG C414 emulation. And I really love how this sounds. We could change this out for like a UA7. We could change it for an SM57. There's kind of a Coles emulation thing, which is the default for this preset when it loads up. I'll just play you a bit of that to show you the difference between that and what the AKG 414 is doing. So it's kind of subtle, but you can hear it responds in the way that it would if you were moving a mic around an amp. I feel like it's got a really nice tone to that. It's not too bright in the top end, not too boomy in the lows, not too pokey in the mids. It's quite balanced. Sounds really nice and smooth, and I think it's going to add a lot of tone when we blend that in with the other tracks. So what we also want to do on this track is add in another high pass EQ. So again, what we're doing is we're just allowing this bass subtrack to be responsible for the low end. I don't want any low end in any of the other bass guitar tracks. I want to just control it with that singular subtrack. So filtering off from 150 hertz again, as we did in the other tracks, and then let's blend this back in with these two and see what that sounds like.
Flooding like an overdose, tell us what we need to know. A little uncontrollable, eyes closed, ready for the baby.
So that amp track is really helping to add the tone to the bass guitar now, and the whole sort of flavor of that bass. It sounds much better than just that dry DI track. So it's adding an awful lot to that mix now. One of the things we do have to at least try and pay attention to, much like we would if we were using an amp and a DI separately, is phase relationship. So I'm just going to check the phase of this amp track by adding in simple gain plugin and then inverting the phase and just see what that sounds like. So I want to make sure that we've not got any phase cancellation going on.
Flooding like an overdose, tell us what we need to know. A little uncontrollable.
So in this case, the phase invert really is just working like a tone shift. It's not necessarily cancelling anything out as such. We can use like phase inversion as almost like another EQ. I like it as it is, uninverted. I think that that sounds good. It's keeping some of that low mid warmth in there. When we flip the phase, it's scooping out a bit of that low mid and maybe making the bass feel a bit thin to my taste anyway. But that's really just about personal taste. I would check it. If you find out there's any mad cancellation going on, then flip the phase. And then if there's not doing any mad cancellation, like in this case, then it's just up to you and it's up to your taste, what you prefer. And for me personally, I prefer it as it was. I'm not going to flip the phase there. So that sounds good. What I would like to do is maybe control some of the dynamics of this bass amp track a bit as well. So I'm just going to go and load up another instance of the Gem Comp 76 and just see if we can control the peaks a bit more. I don't want to be quite as aggressive as I was on that DI track. I want to treat it a bit more like I would if this was a standard amp track and just do a bit of compression to control some of those peaks so they're not jumping up and down way too much. So let's take a listen to what that sounds like. I'm going to use the revision D again, and I'm maybe going to go with a little less compression on this version, and let's hear what that sounds like. That sounds pretty cool, but I feel like it's maybe making it a bit pokey and a bit too aggressive. So let's try the Gem Comp LA and see if that's any softer. I might choose the 3A instance in this case and just see what that sounds like. Yeah, that sounds better to me. That feels a little bit more focused. It's not as aggressive as that Gemcom 76 where it's really pulling the pick out. It's making it sort of a bit like harsh. I feel like that Gemcom LA3A is nice, smooth. It's fast enough that it's catching those peaks, but it's not completely squashing it. And we can do a bit more dynamic control later on down the line as well. So let's take a listen to this in the context of the rest of the mix. I'll mute the vocals so that we can hear the bass line a little bit more, and then we'll take a look at what we need to do next. So you can hear how it's really starting to shape up now. We have this bass amp track, which is providing most of the tone. The sub is obviously providing the low end. And then we have this bass DI track, which is just helping to bring some of that pick sound and that original DI track through. And where we've slammed it with the compressor, it's helping that mid-range cut through from the sort of pick sound of the bass guitar. What I want to do is try and bring a little bit more of that mid-range forward now in the mix and just help the bass cut through, particularly in the busier parts of the mix. This is something that we could use automation for as well, is in certain parts where it feels like maybe the bass is getting lost, we can automate the level up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a copy of this DI track again, and I'm going to bring it down to this bass disc track. And what this is some saturation, some distortion on the bass, and that's helping just to bring it through the rest of the mix. So first up on this track, we have another instance of the Gemcom 76. These settings for the compressor and the EQ are the same as they are on the DI track. So I've got the fast, relatively fast attack, quite fast release, and then we're slamming that with the 1176 revision D. And then I've got another instance of the channel strip EQ. Again, filter up everything to 150 hertz so that we're just leaving the low end to the sub. And that's basically an exact copy now of this bass DI track. But what we're doing after this is we're adding some of the Gem Sculpt Tube, which is a tube style distortion saturation plugin, which sounds really great. It sounds amazing on bass. It's great for adding that grit and that mid-range to the bass, which is going to help it cut through in the mix. So let's take a listen to what that sounds like. I've got it on the distortion type P2. There's no high pass filter, but then there is this low pass filter at 6K, which is just shaving off all the top end. Got a little bit of drive. The bias control is set to 8. Let's hear what that sounds like on its own, and then we'll hear it with the rest of the tracks. So that filter is just smoothing off some of that pick sound and a bit of extra noise. We're not pushing it into complete distortion, but it's just adding some edge and some grit. Let's hear what that sounds like with the other tracks. So that's a bit more subtle, but what that's doing is helping just to push the bass guitar forward a little bit more, allow us to hear it in the mix a bit more. If we want that to cut through even further, then we can add some more drive, some more saturation and bring the level up. But I quite like where it is there. It's just helping it pop through. And this is going to be particularly useful on things like small speakers, earphones and stuff where we don't have this low end extension that we would have on the studio monitors. It's going to help it pop through a lot more on smaller speakers and just make that bass line a bit more audible. So like I say, don't want loads of it. Just a little bit in there is really subtle, but it's just helping cut through much more in the mix. So lastly, what I want to do now is add some width to this bass line and make it feel like it's filling the speakers much more and it's filling the whole mix much more than it currently is. At the minute, it feels a bit mono and pokey, and I want it to feel bigger and wider, but I don't want it to feel bigger and wider in the whole song. What I want to do is just accentuate certain sections like the pre-chorus, the chorus, the bridge, where the track becomes wider and it becomes more energetic. I want the bass line to feel like it grows as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm literally just going to copy this down to this bass width track now, and then I'm going to delete the parts which are in the verse. So we have this bass line in the verse. I'm going to delete that. And then I'm going to do the same in the first verse as well. And what this is going to do is when the bass line drops in the pre-chorus and the chorus, with the processing that we're going to use, this is going to help it widen up and going to give the track much more energy, and it's going to feel like the track starts to fill the stereo field as soon as those more energetic parts of the song come in. So let's just take a look at what we've got going on. We've got firstly another instance of the Gem Comp 76, much like we had on the DI track. Again, I'm using the same compression settings just to pin the dynamic down. And then we have the EQ here, which is again rolling off everything 150 hertz, but it's also now doing a roll off of the top end and this high end shelf to control that top. And we'll take a look at what that's doing and exactly why in a sec, because after this we're using the Gem mod plugin. And the Gem mod is a modulation plugin based off of the Roland Dimension D, which is an old effects unit from the 80s. It was great for sort of wide chorus sounds. And I've got it set to mode 3. The mix is currently about 70%. So let's take a listen to what this is doing to that bass line on its own, and then we'll hear it with the rest of the track. Let's hear that with the rest of the bass guitar, and then we'll hear it in the mix. So you could have that in your choruses for the moments where the track becomes really wide. You could have it throughout the whole track. You could automate it for certain moments in the song, bring it up and down. There's so many different options by using this multing technique of having separate tracks with separate processing on. Allows us so much more control over the individual details of the bass. And that's the sort of subtle difference between just having a single bass that does the same thing throughout the whole track to having these moments where it really comes alive. I want to just do a couple more things just to add a little bit extra to it and just to polish that sound right up. So what we're going to do first is head to this bass bus, which is where all of these tracks are being routed to this bus 39. You'll see they're all going to bus 39 in this track stack, and that's here. And the first thing that we have on this is another instance of the Gem Comp LA, this time using the LA2A. And this is just to smooth out the whole thing now, where we've got the whole bass line and all these different multed bass tracks coming through this bus. I want to just glue them together a bit more with some extra compression and make sure that these peaks are still nice and controlled. So let's take a listen to what that's doing. You'll notice I'm using this LF sense, which is the low frequency sensitivity, and that's pushing more towards minus 10 dB. So around about 2 o'clock at the minute. And what that's doing is just letting some low end through. You'll hear if I push it all the way back to 0, it's squashing the low end, whereas this works as kind of like a high pass filter for the side chain of the compressor. So it's allowing that low end through without squashing it. And this is what it sounds like the other way. So somewhere around 2 o'clock feels nice. It's like a nice amount of low end, but it's also keeping it nice and tight. And then we're just using the wet dry mix to let a little bit of the dry signal through as well, so we're not completely squashing it. Next up, we have an instance of the Gem EQP, which is a pull textile emulation. And this thing sounds great. You'll notice that we've got the MEQ section here and an EQP 1A section as well, plus this filter over here. And all of these things are on currently, so we're doing quite a lot here. But let's take a listen to what this is doing, and then I'll walk you through exactly what's happening. So in this MEQ section, we're boosting it around 700 hertz, which is helping some of that mid-range, particularly as he runs up the neck. This is helping that come through a lot more. We're dipping out around 300 hertz just to get rid of some boxiness. And then in this EQP, what we're doing is boosting at 60, so that's bumping the low end. And we've also got an attenuation happening there. And what happens in a Pultec style EQ is when you boost and attenuate at the same point, it creates like a bump. And that's going to help give a bit more sub-impact through that boost and attenuation. It's not just a whole low shelf, which is going to boost all of that low end. It's attenuating some stuff, boosting it. And what that does is help to create a nice, warm, fat, sort of punchy bass sound around about 60 hertz. Then we have this broad bandwidth boost at 3K, which is basically everything above 3K being boosted to help that mid-range cut through. And then we're rolling off everything from 5K just to clean up that top end. So let's just take a listen to that. I'll flick through all of these on and off with the filter, the EQP, 1A, and the MEQ as well. And let's hear what that sounds like. Yeah, it's giving it a nice rounded low end and a bit more of a mid-range push. You notice I've also got this clipper on, and what that's doing is just shaving off a few of those peaks, a bit of soft clipping as it comes in, adds a bit more saturation and character to that. So lastly, what I'm noticing is where we've used so much fast compression and we've boosted some of that mid-range a bit as well, what's happening is the pick sound is really cutting through a bit too much. There's some transients that are poking out that feel a little bit uncomfortable to me. So I want to try and tame those. And in order to do that, I'm going to use an instance of the Gem tape desk, which is a really great sounding tape saturation. I've got other videos on this, which you may have seen before, and I love this plugin. I use it all the time and sounds really good for just kind of smoothing off those peaks and making a softer, smoother, sort of tapey style sound. So let's take a listen to what this is doing to the bass, and this will be the last thing that we do in the chain. Yeah, great. That's really nice for adding a bit more depth to that low end, adding some of that tape compression, which is just kind of gluing the whole thing together. I've got it on the N80 setting over here, which is like a Neve channel emulation. So the tape desk has a combination of preamp, mixing desk, and tape emulation going on, and then 15 inches per second tape speed, and that's adding a nice low end, smoothing out some of those peaks. So finally, let's take a listen to what the original dry DI sound sounds like in the mix versus our processed bass guitar, and you'll see what a difference we've made. The difference is enormous. You can really hear how that initial DI dry bass guitar sound is flapping all over the place. The low end's jumping up, the dynamics jumping up, sounds really dry and dead, and it doesn't really kind of add any excitement to the track. Whereas the processed bass guitar, now where we've added this amp in for the tone, we've added the distortion to help it cut through, we're controlling the low end on this subtrack, then we're adding that width, really solidifies it, really adds that depth and that tone, which makes it sound like a finished record, and I'm super happy with what we've done. So if you found this useful and you like what you heard, then I definitely recommend you go and check out all the plugins that we've been using today. I particularly recommend this Made in Rock JUP 320 bass amp emulation. This thing sounds great. This is really kind of integral to the bass guitar sound that we've created today. So I recommend you go check that out. Check out all the other plugins as well if you get a chance. Please do leave a comment below. Let me know how you're using these Gem plugins in your mixes, what you like to do with your bass guitar. Give this video a thumbs up, subscribe, and hopefully I'll see you soon.